This morning we have with us Gioia, who is the State of California Poet Laureate and former chair of the National Endowment for the Arts. We also have Lord Michael Dobbs with us. Lord Dobbs was fantastic last night. The Annenberg, if you were there. I just learned something last night, that because we're in Southern California, may I call you Mike? Keep that to you. Once in a while, it just makes
Surely
it
not,
bad.
and I'm going to call you Shirley.
I guess you'll be Michael. Or Lord. I think that's
No.
got my message. We also have, I'd like to interrupt for 1 second. This library has had a poetry workshop for the last 18 years, not this building, 10 here in our previous location. Dorothea Bispas is with us today. Dorothea, would you just stand or wave? Or Dorothea is Rancho Mirage's poet laureate and does it beautifully. And funnels some great minds in this city of all ages who come to Dorothea wanting to be poets, and they leave as almost poets, in some cases real poets. So Dorothy has done a marvelous service for our city and our region. Thank you so much. Now today we're going to be talking about political incorrectness, I think, being the bane of college campuses, so the politically correct umbrella seems to be shielding intellectual freedom on college campuses. We're also going to talk a little bit about government funding of the arts. And Dana and I had a brief conversation before we began, so we may start there. There was a show at the Brooklyn Museum some years ago, and an artist by the name of Andres Serrano created a work called Kiss Christ, in which he photographed a cross, a crucifix, inserted into a jar of his own urine. And this became controversial, as one might expect. Dana, would you want to address this? Because you were nearby when this was going on. This was your wheelhouse.
Well, no, I wasn't at the NEA, but this is the NEA I inherited. Is the microphone on?
No.
Okay, I think you just had to
Yeah,
turn
our
mine on.
technician will crank it up a bit.
Am I audible?
Yes.
This was actually before my time at the NEA, but this is the NEA I inherited. And the issue really wasn't that Andrew Serrano had exhibited this photograph. He had exhibited this photograph paid for by government money, which was the issue. And I think that is actually a real issue. I think there is a difference between what one has in the private sector and what one pays with public money. So I'll give you a very simple story. William Faulkner, the Nobel Prize winning novelist, was the postmaster of Oxford, Mississippi. And this was a political favor, just so he had a job and he showed up and didn't have to work much. But after a couple of years, he quit. He said, I'm sick and tired of being at the beck and call of every son of a bitch who can afford a 2-cent stamp. But being at the, we have the mayor pro tem here, don't we? When you are, when you're in political office, you are at the beck and call of every citizen. And unfortunately, that is the given of democracy. So when I came to the NEA, it was a completely discredited institution. It was embroiled in scandal. It had actually been voted out of existence by the US Congress about 2 years before, and it had been saved at the last minute by members of the Nixon administration, who came into the Senate and convinced them that it would be a disgrace if the US shut down the National Endowment for the Arts. So they downsized it, really rather mercilessly. The people were, half the people were fired, the budget was cut in half. And I had, when I came in to run this, which was not a job actually I wanted, it's a whole other story about how I ended up in it. It seemed to me that we had to, if the institution were worth saving, it would have to be an institution which in a sense had the confidence of the American public. And so I reimagined what the institution was. And it seemed to me that what you really had were, two things that we're trying to do. One was to promote excellence, best art and best arts education possible. And the second was to promote democracy, which is to say that we served all Americans or we had created, and this actually leads into the other topics that we'll be discussing. We had created historically an institution which did a pretty good job of serving a tiny artistic elite and not really reaching the public. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. When I came into the NE, I asked them to look at where our grants had gone. And there was 30% of the United States which had never gotten a cent. We had some places that got about 200-300 times as much money as the average. We had never done one program in nearly 40 years that reached the American military. And so it just seemed to me that one of the things that we had to do was to be disciplined about reaching every corner of the United States. And we began to do this, and guess what happened? We promoted programs of really undisputable value. We went everywhere in the country, and people liked us. Our budget went up every year. There were the controversies that had embroiled us were gradually forgotten. And the fact is that America wants to support the arts, but they want to support the arts in a way which people feel is positive and constructive. So I just leave it in terms of that this can be done, but you have to look at it in a sense from a perspective, a political perspective, which is that in a democracy you are serving the people.
Well, you really put the national back into the National Endowment for the Arts. You made it broad-based and you took the map of the United States and placed art throughout the U.S. because, as we were saying, when it was elite, it was probably Boston, New York, Chicago, etc.
Yeah, Boston, New York, Chicago. You know, 10 cities got almost all of the money.
Michael, what can you tell us about the British approach? Is the tax-funded British art?
We have something called the Arts Council, which is effectively very much like the NEA. It's responsible for distributing tax money to all sorts of causes, but the choice is, the battle is still the same. Are these causes, worthy of taxpayers' money? And it becomes an increasing pressure nowadays when everywhere the tax dollar, the tax pound is under examination. If we don't have enough to fund sick people and hospitals and educational establishments in the way that we would want to be able to do it, how dare we fund people who want to do what, what's his name? Serrano. But there is a balance which is never possible to strike. But one must always struggle to find that balance. We must remember that the greatest artists, the greatest cultural icons of history, like Mozart, for instance, they were all sponsored. They didn't do it because, he hears Shakespeare. Shakespeare was probably the greatest writer in the English language, but he was what we call a bums-on-seats man. He had to find the money he wrote for audiences, not to simply indulge himself. And that is part of the most important part, I think, of art. It has to speak to somebody other than the artists themselves. And in order to justify taxpayers' money, it seems to me that that communication process has to be a vigorous one and a reasonably popular one, in the sense that you've got to find an audience who is willing to support it. Now, I don't know whether Serrano has a big fan base out there, in which case perhaps he should go and get a little bit of sponsorship from them.
Well, creating a scandal with government money is the best possible advertising an artist can have. Your rates go up overnight. But there's three different systems for supporting the art in the West. There's the continental system. There's the British system, which is a little different than the American because you get lottery money and you have certain things that are independent of legislation. Then you've got the United States, which has legislative money. But if you look at this, I had a conversation once every 3 weeks where the Minister of Culture of France, the Minister of Culture of Belgium, the Minister of Culture, Italy would come in, and the French are the clearest ones. They begin by telling you of the vast superiority of the French system, which funds these things. Then the second, three topics. The second topic was the vast inferiority of the American system, which didn't give as much money as the French. And then the third thing was that why does America produce better art than France? Why is America has all this art that everyone in the world wants? And the French culture, certainly in our lifetimes, one of the most interesting global phenomenon has been the retreat of French culture. When I was in high school, just for theater, you think of theater in France, you had Ennui, Beckett, Sartre, Genet, Gilles Darod, Girardot, who am I forgetting? But everywhere in the world, French drama was being put on. Now you'd be hard-pressed to come up with, even a theater goer, a single living French playwright. And I cannot think it's coincidental that the retreat of France in music, in art, in theater, in literature, coincided with the largest government funding of art in human history. And the American system is brutal. And actually, this is the perfect group to talk. I mean, how many of you are what's the term, Jamie? Is it
Patron.
How many of you are patrons of this event? Angels. You know, I mean, you're the ones that have made this possible. There's probably some small grant from the city, some small grant from the state, but it's private patronage. It's much harder in the United States to sponsor the arts, but what we do in the United States is that we call forth our own citizens to support it for their own communities. And that actually is, it's almost a model of the American governmental system, which is people taking responsibility, leadership, patronage, to make their own communities better places to live. It's much harder because, Jamie, you have no idea what your budget's gonna be next year. You've got to do all this work, but if you do it, not only do you raise the money, you raise the participation, the interest, the incentive. And so that's the American system. It scares the hell out of the French. Because in France, you know how much money you're gonna get for the next 20 years. The trouble is in France, you're either funded or you're not. There is nobody outside the system that can survive. Italy is also, I don't mean to go on so long. Italy is wonderful. I love opera. I mean, opera to me is my favorite art form. Italy has 11 opera houses that are treated as national treasures. They are given fantastic subsidies by the federal government, equivalent about $100 million each. But it's not unusual in Italy for an opera house to go on strike and not put on a single performance in a year, but everybody gets paid. So you have this, you created a system, which is very comfortable for the artists, but really provides a kind of an undependable service to the community. And that's sort of the everything is always, I'm an Italian, so I can say this, the extreme of any problem is always visible in Italy. That's the kind of extreme example of this. But I think the American system is more difficult. I wouldn't mind having a British lottery. I mean, if we could get a certain base.
Can I just use the British lottery? We have a huge lottery which raises tens of millions of pounds every week, and a huge chunk of the profits does get given to good causes, independently of the government. And it has made a transformational difference to so many, not only sort of art galleries and individual artists, but all sorts of popular residential, cultural phenomenon, buildings, charities, and things like that. Forgive me, I don't want to...
No, that's exactly, that's exactly what I, want to hear. So I think the British system, which is very much like the United States, is a little bit better because it has that additional source of funding. But I think it would be a mistake in the US to see what artists want. Artists want everything paid for always, and security. I mean, who doesn't want security in life? But the fact is, I think culturally, it would not create a better situation for the country. I think that there's a certain energy you get where you have to engage your audience. I mean, I think of two of the greatest artists who ever lived, Shakespeare and Verdi. They were men of the marketplace. They created something that the public wanted, and they made their careers in a sense by building their audience and and creating, in a sense, to a certain degree, they created their own art forms. They took, Shakespeare took theater, which was a relatively small art form when he came into it. And by the time Shakespeare retired, he was the most successful entertainment executive in the world. We don't tend to think of him in that way, but he was, he had an eye on, he had points in the production and got a percentage of the profits, which is what allowed him to retire early and buy himself a phony coat of arms so he could become a lord.
Well, that's how it works.
Well, I do wonder whether I was given my lordship for my contribution to English literature. On the other hand, I suspect it might have something to do with the fact that I spent far too long working away in politics and working my way right up the intestinal chain of the political system that I've now got parking rights.
That is a distinction.
But that security of income for an artist is treacherous, I think. Truman Capote always said that once in cold blood it made his life miserable because the checks in those days for $120,000 a year, or whatever it was, quite sufficient to live very well and to kill the insanity. And it just makes you drink too much and sleep too late.
And from my own point of view, I mean, I agree entirely with what you're saying there, that the artists don't deserve security. It's actually self-defeating to give them security, because I've been writing now for almost 30 years, and I can honestly tell you some of my books are better than some of the others. You try to do your best with every book. You try to make every book a little better. Sometimes you don't succeed. But I hope over the course of time that my proficiency in telling stories, which is what I do, has increased. But the seminal moments where I really have made what I thought was creative breakthroughs have not been the days when I've sat back comfortable thinking, hey, this is easy, this is wonderful. That is the road to ruination. It's when I got up in the morning, sat on the edge of the bed and held my head in terror, saying, how do I do this? How do I provide for my family with what I'm going to embark upon next? And it's that sense of terror, the fear of failure, if you like, that has pressed me on, and I'm sure has forced most artists on to do something which they didn't expect themselves to be able to do. And whatever success I've had and continue to have, it's been based actually not on success, but if you like, on fear. And certainly not on subsidy. And what I do object to, and what happens in Britain, I mean, I think we have a system which is not too bad in Britain. The government doesn't interfere, the taxpayer isn't required to do too much, because we all go out and we gamble in the lottery, and the lottery does a huge amount. But you have, and I will say this, you have what I regard as being the complete double standards of successful artists, actors arriving in their chauffeur-driven cars at the back doors of theatres, going on to packed houses because they are then people of great talent, and then taking the opportunity to make absolutely damning political statements, indulging their positions, to make damning political statements about politicians, governments, and the way that they run the world, and expecting people to, because they happen to be celebrities, their voice actually counts. Because they actually happen to have played Shakespeare once or twice, they therefore know how the world runs. And we have one or two examples of this in Britain recently. And I think that it's a travesty. We artists, if you like, have to know, to a certain extent, what we are good at and what we are not good at. And what we are not good at is actually being able to run the world. That's why, sadly, why we have to have politicians. Let them screw it up, rather than screw it up themselves.
But Michael, that's shocking. We would never allow that in Hollywood. Well, you know, we have had some artists that have been major political leaders. Nero, Hitler, Mussolini was a novelist, Stalin was a poet, Ho Chi Minh was a poet, Mao was a poet. I mean, there's a real danger, I think, of it. What an artist tries to do, I think, if you're a writer and there's a section that doesn't work, you cut it out. You have a line you don't like, you cross it out. You can't do that with humanity. And I think that there's a certain, you know, there's a certain level of, not stupidity, but ordinariness that is, I think, important in politics, which is to say, you know, everybody's opinion in this room matters. You may not agree with it, you may not ultimately do a policy that's in support of it, but that, you know, that you have to, you know, sort of compromise and, you know, and what's the right word? Consolidate these things. When William F. Buckley said something, when I read it, I think I was about 20 years old, I thought it was stupid. He said, I'd rather be ruled by the first 100 names in the Boston phone book than the faculty of Harvard. I thought it was stupid, but I now agree with him. I would rather be ruled by the first 100 names in the Boston phone book, because those people would say, well, I'm not that much smarter than you. I'll listen to you. We'll get along together. And I think there's a level of common sense that artists do not possess conspicuously. Us obviously, except that we're quite brilliant in other respects.
Well, Michael said not all of his books are that great,
Yeah.
so we do need that.
Yeah.
And they're all great, but some are greater than others.
Oh. But the political sphere is different than the aesthetic sphere. In aesthetics, you have to, you have your vision and you destroy everything that you're, there, but your vision, because that's how you make it a self-contained world. You can't treat reality that way. It's inhuman.
There is. I find this in my own personal life. It's a real dilemma because as a writer for almost 30 years, writing is a wonderfully self-indulgent process. You decide what it is you want to do, and you go out and do it. You only really, at the end of the day, have to please yourself. Of course, there's an audience to please, but you please it in your own way. And you pose questions, you come up with answers to those questions, and if you don't like the answers, you can go back and change the questions.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. But as a politician, politics is entirely the other end of the spectrum. It's not about self-indulgence. Successful politics is all about a team game. It's a bit like a game of football. I mean, you have to be part of a team. You can't score all the goals or all the points yourself. You have to do. There's a manager who's instructing you how to play this game, and you cannot grab the ball and keep it to yourself. And I find that really difficult emotionally at times, having to split my life between my self-indulgence as a writer and the team playing that I have to do, knowing that I've got to pass the ball to a player that perhaps I would prefer not to, or to play in a way that I don't want to. But as a politician, it's the only way to get things done, because there is no point in politics in being a crying in the wilderness. You actually have to use those slippery, dirty levers of power.
What's interesting, Michael, is that, I think in some ways in politics you can often get what you want done. But you have to, the only way you can get it is to make other people want that too. And what happens is they always add their little twist. You go, I don't like that. But I'll say 9 times out of 10, when you actually got it done, it's actually, in the real world, damn it, those other suggestions made it better. It made it more practical. It made it more appealing to more people. And so so in a funny way, there's a dialectic that goes on in public life. Not always, but if you have somebody with some vision running it, you can actually carry an idea into reality, and the transformations are largely transformations that make it more workable.
It's a little bit like the House of Lords, actually, if I can just a little far into the House of Lords area. Because we're an unelected chamber. People say, how on earth can you have an unelected House of Lords doing serious governmental work? Well, it actually works rather well, because we are a composting machine. Because what happens is we are a revising machine of legislations. We take all of the, I'm going to call it rubbish for want of a better word, which comes from the House of Commons. It then disappears into the House of Lords for 6 months or more into complete darkness, because nobody knows what it is we do. I mean, we're not in the headlines every day. But I tell you, we work away at it and put this into it, and whatever comes out 6 months later, it may not be perfect, but it is always more fragrant and more fertile than what we do. So, you see, I'm a parliamentary worm. And that's the job that I do.
Let's talk about political correctness, if we may, for a couple of minutes. And
Just a couple of minutes?
For the rest of this conversation. The Atlantic Monthly had, in its September issue, I was mentioning 2 pieces that really stayed with those of us who read it. That is that, and you're all familiar with this, that many stand-up comics are terrified to go on college campuses now and simply will not do it. Those venues are off limits. And that I boast that this library is a house of ideas and a haven for intellectual freedom, and we really believe that. I think this festival shows that. College campuses have shut down intellectual freedom. They've shut down discourse. They've put race off limits. And certainly the treatment of Islam as a topic it's toxic. It's toxic. protected and toxic at the same time.
It's the ruination of an educational system if we allow it to continue, because surely, I think we would all agree that the idea of an education is to broaden the mind, to engage with ideas, not to narrow the mind and refuse to deal with ideas that you find uncomfortable. The whole purpose and process of intellectual growth is engaging with things that you didn't either understand or didn't agree with, and derive from that engagement a better position to arrive at. And we have the same problem in Britain too. I mean, I understand that Woodrow Wilson is now somebody who you can't talk about, and we must take his name off educational establishments. We're going through exactly the same process in Britain. There's a Rhodes Scholar. Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. We've had so many fine Americans who've been Rhodes Scholars. We have a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford at the moment who's leading a campaign to tear down the statue of Cecil Rhodes. Because by 21st century standards, what he did and what he stood for, in some respects, is unacceptable, totally unacceptable. But we are now imposing on a previous era our own value judgments. Instead of learning and glorying the process by which we've gone from the 19th century to the 21st century in our understanding of communities and races and everything else, we are saying that ours is the only way, and refusing to engage with other civilizations. And I think I'm a huge believer. I'm hugely proud to be part of the Western community. I couldn't think of any other part of the world I was born in and had my children raised in. I'm very proud to be a British citizen. I'm very proud to be part of that heritage, not believing that everything that Britain has done has been good or fruitful, but at the end of the day, we have a system which is more open, more free, and more and can advance better than any other part of the world. Which is why all of the great advances, all of the great inventions come from this part of the world and not from places like Asia or Africa or the Middle East. But what I think we sometimes fail to realize is the process of persuasion and standing by our ideas, which is why, for instance, I mentioned this last night, it's why the Berlin Wall was torn down, because people wanted to share in our ideas and values. We didn't have to blow it away in the end. It was torn down by those who suffered from it. And so I think that the political correctness is actually playing the game of, if you like, the other side.
Yes.
It's what we see other cultures do, and we know that it is wrong, and we know that it is short-sighted.
We're killing the conversation. We really are. Political correctness kills the conversation, and it glorifies cultures that do not deserve that kind of dignity, in my opinion.
Well, I look at it, I agree that freedom of speech no longer exists in the university. I think it's undeniable, no matter what sort of flimsy argument you can bring to the contrary. I think that a way of looking at it is historical. If you look, what were colleges and universities to begin with? They were religious establishments that trained clergy in a particular creed, and they had a few aristocrats, or professionals that would come through them. So even at Oxford, you had to sign that you agreed with these theological positions for you to get a degree from Oxford. Actually, I think if you were above 14, you had to sign that you actually had to get entry into Oxford. Catholics couldn't go to Oxford, Jews couldn't go to Oxford. This actually lasted until the 19th century. But United States, all of our colleges began as seminaries. And I think what we've seen is that in the 21st century, American universities have become religious establishments again. It's a religion of secularism. It's a religion of the left. And they are, in a historical sense, they've returned to the origins of what universities were, which were ideological establishments to train a clergy. We have this new clergy, and what you had was a relatively brief period in the middle where freedom of speech existed. And I think this is the way of looking at it. when you're in a community, people are always happiest when you all agree with each other, or more likely pretend to agree with each other. And so you have all these people that are afraid to say what they really believe in a university context because they will be disciplined or punished or even fired. I mean, if you look at the last 6 months, very good people have been fired from major universities for peccadillos, because that's the ferocity of the religious zeal of the secular religion. And I think it's a major issue. Now it's more of an issue at some places than others. You could just open the headlines, where it is. But if this continues, it will essentially strangle the creative power, especially the humanities and social sciences of these institutions, because all they can do is basically repeat the truisms, of their creed. And so I think it's a huge issue in American intellectual life now, and and I don't think it will be naturally correct. I mean, if you look at in the United States, there's a couple of trends that are going on in universities. One is that they are becoming privatized. You have the institutions that are growing are the private institutions. And I'll give you an example. In the lifetime of most of the people in this room, the University of California, and I mean this with great respect to Oxford and Cambridge, was the greatest educational institution in the history of humanity. It had a dozen campuses. You could do everything from rocket science, theoretical physics, to classics, to anthropology, at the highest level of anywhere in the world. In 1972, University of California at Berkeley, a single campus, was more highly rated than Harvard and Yale put together. It was in a class by itself. And what did it cost to attend the university? It was free for Californians. Californians created the finest university in the world for their own citizens, for their advancement. Flash forward 40 years, we have the quality of the schools have come down, the cost of attending them, and they're paying themselves by bringing people from out of state and out of the country to balance their books. Meanwhile, this goes to the second trend. American universities are becoming fundamentally Italian Renaissance city-states. They are. I mean, if you go to Palo Alto, you cross over to my alma mater, Stanford. Which Lorenzo de Medici, had not a finer kingdom, nor one more cut off from everything around it. And they create these enormous things of wealth. The endowment of Harvard is larger than the GDP of many small countries. So you have these wealthy city-states, and then it goes into the third, that they have developed their own ideology, which is relatively separate from the society which supports them, the alumni who supports them. And I think that these are not good trends. Where are we meeting today? We're meeting in a public library. Anybody have to pay to come in? I mean, this is open to the citizens of this. Some people paid a lot of money to allow other people to come for free.
Well, actually, everybody.
Did everybody pay? Okay, well, I take that back. Shame on you. But you have a public.
Almost had it right.
Yeah, but the books here, the space here, is open to the populace, and we've lost in this country a sense of a productive public space. In so many communities, the public spaces are the worst spaces. The private spaces are the nicest ones. And even our private universities, I think, in some ways reflect that dichotomy. There's not bad trends.
Fantastic. What you're saying is just, it's music to us and what we try to do in this library. So thank you enough. And also, I think we're ready now to hear from our audience, from our community.
We're talking about working with funding for the MBA. One of the subjects I find very rarely covered is the 501c3. I mean, everybody gets the deduction, but every charity proposed donation relates to every school,
It's government co-funding. Because, the question was about basically about tax deductible donations. I think that actually is the greatest strength of the American system, because it allows you to determine where your money goes and not a bureaucrat. So if you want to, if you have a particular charity, you want to go a particular cause that you want to do, you can back this. But it's really just government co-funding. So let's say you give every $100 you give, the government maybe pays 40. And so I like the fact that the government has to go halvesies, with me. That it comes out of the thing. But that is actually, that's the strength of this, and that's why you should be very careful about. You should give as much money as possible, but you should be very careful where you give it. You should give it to organizations that you believe do a good job of reaching these things you believe in and are doing it efficiently. Sure.
Funds my fund run Mirage. And that was the first thing that down to us. So what is the issue for the market days? And then there's also the book that had a problem. You really also have the problem today. I'm now the Gioia and Black one, so it's not made and so how I wasn't sure how you would do that.
Well, no, I actually that's it. The question is about Serrano and Mapplethorpe, all of the scandals that were in the NEA. And what this was basically was that there were public exhibitions, the most, that were done that a great many people found deeply offensive, that were paid for by public money, which led, Congress to try to, in some ways, control this. I mean, Congress wanted to give artists, as much freedom as possible, but there was a certain difficult to define balance. This happened before I got to the NEA. What I inherited was the aftermath of those exhibitions. And I think that, it really comes out of a moment in culture, which is still going on right now, where a great many of the artists in our culture hate this society, which to a certain degree takes care of them. The society which actually gives them freedom to do, what they're doing, to give them the freedom to offend people. And I don't think anybody in the arts wants to censor people. The question really is there a different set of responsibilities with public money than with private money? And that's really what the whole controversy, I think, is ultimately about. And I think, yes, there is. I think that when you're spending taxpayers' money, you have a different set of responsibilities. It's not solely about, to me, once you get into a scandal, you're in damage control, and damage control doesn't really help anybody. It's just everybody's trying to cover their ass. To me, the solution was to understand what it was you should be doing in the first place, how you should be doing it, and how you could produce programs that the vast, I'm not talking about 99%, plus of Americans said, that's a good use of money. That's bringing good things in a good way to the right places. No, you can't. No, you can't. And to this day, the NEA never censors anybody.
One more quick one.
We have no censorship on any grant. The question is about some people were fired for peccadillos. Once again, this is a legalistic situation, and I don't have precise recall of these things, but I'll give you one example as I recall it. At Occidental, I believe it was, this one dean was writing saying that he was very concerned that some students from non-traditional backgrounds would feel uncomfortable, they're trying to work to make sure that's not happening. And that sentence was considered so hateful and racist that he his resignation was demanded. Now, you cannot tell me that that fellow did that either out of ill will or out of racism, but it was somehow he had gotten this month's politically correct language wrong. And that's how bad it's become. It's not just about being politically correct, it's about being politically correct in the latest and greatest way.
And David, you mentioned one important word a little while back, which was responsibilities. Everybody on campus nowadays is talking about their rights. And those rights are regarded as being self-contained and indulgent, and you can take them to extremes. What they completely fail to do is that rights do not exist on their own. They are matched by responsibilities. And the only way that we are going to get this balance put back into our public dialogue is to remind people that rights must be matched by responsibilities. And rights. If you have a right to an education, you also have a responsibility to use that education for other people and for the wider good.
Thank you.